Hello and welcome to Pit Talk, a Fox Sports and Speed Cafe Formula One podcast. On today's episode, Max Verstappen wins from 6th on the grid to start his summer holidays on an 8-race win streak. Aussie Oscar Piastri impresses on a soaking wet sprint day with 2nd on the grid and at the flag. And Alpine puts the broom through management in a big shake-up for the French team. My name's Michael Laminato, motorsport writer for Fox Sports Australia. It's great to have your company and the company of my two co-hosts from Speed Cafe. He was robbed of the gold Logie. It's Matt Kosh.
The standard was low if I'm running for gold Logie.
I don't even know
And
what
also
gold
from
Logie
Speed
is,
Cafe,
so
exactly, wondering what a Logie is. It's Ian Parks.
Hello. We've just dried out, Matt and I think, after a very soggy weekend in Spa.
I think my shoes are
Rain.
still wet.
It really was the topic of the day, really. If it wasn't the order of the day, then someone clearly over-ordered, I'm willing to say, for wet weather, although it didn't affect Sunday pretty much. We'll get to the results of, or some of the other results around the weekend later on. Of course, we're going to talk about Oscar Piastri as we get there. But this was another pretty straightforward win for Max Verstappen. I'm going to borrow a line from Andrew Benson from the BBC, because I think it sums it up actually really well. When the main point of interest in a Grand Prix is a debate between the winner and his race engineer about how fast he should or should not be going, you know the opposition are in trouble. He was about a second quicker than Perez in qualifying, about 0.8 a second a lap quicker in the race. Matt, is he just embarrassing everyone at this point?
It's a class of one, really, isn't it? Now, I've got to preface this with, I was down in the media pen throughout the race, so I didn't actually get to hear the exchange. I've sort of only learnt it secondhand. But that Red Bull is phenomenal, isn't it? I mean, we saw it in qualifying. Even though Max took the grid penalty, he was miles faster than anyone else. To come from, 6th on the grid to the lead by lap 13, I think it was. There were bets on
17.
what lap he'd take the lead. And it wasn't far off. So, yeah, it's extraordinary. We know that Red Bull is fast in a straight line and the DRS effect is significant or more so than on the other cars. So it's a circuit that plays to the favours of the Red Bull. But even still, you know, he drove by Sergio Perez, the guy in the other Red Bull. So it's just extraordinary. And, you know, Andrew Benson, he's been around a long time. He knows how the game's played. He understands motorsport better than most. He's absolutely right. But what we've got to do, I think, is just step back and appreciate what we're seeing. Because, yes, the Belgian Grand Prix was dull, and it was the Max Verstappen show, again, for the 8th time in a row. But what we're seeing is generational. This level of success we have never seen in Formula One. It's 73 years old now. There's a couple of ways you can cut that up and argue it, but 12 or 13 races in a row, 8 on the bounce for Max. I mean, that's just, it's unheralded. We mentioned it last week, Ian, when we were talking about Ferrari and Mercedes and those periods, but this is something different. And let's not look at the race and go, oh, it's boring because Max won. Let's look at the race and going, bloody hell, Max is good. And just enjoy it for what it is.
Yeah,
Hey, Ian, what did you make of the radio chatter, if you managed?
Go on, finish your question. I didn't catch it.
I was only going to say, to stretch on from that, I mean, Ian, what did you make of the radio chatter? It's proved to be a little bit of a talking point in the aftermath of this race, the debating between Max and his engineer, Giampiero Lambiase. What did you make of the way they communicate with each other, particularly given the context that, I mean, Max is having pretty much everything his own way in terms of the championship. It's not like there should be a lot of tension.
I don't think it is tension. I mean, Christian Horner has summed it up perfectly in the past when he's described these two as an old married couple, given the way they interact with one another. Lambiase has been Max's race engineer since Max's very first race in Formula One with Red Bull, just to clarify. So we're going back quite a few years. So what we're looking, 7 years? Is this the 7-year itch? Potentially between these two. I mean, it was sparked by the fact that during qualifying on Friday evening, Max used the F word 3 times in a rant at Giampiero. And that was unusual. That was uncalled for. It was unnecessary. He didn't need to stoop so low. But again, it's a sign of Max's perfection, that he wants everything correct down to the last nth degree. And if something isn't quite right, he will voice his concern. And unfortunately for Giampiero, he's always the man on the end of it. And it says much about the way Red Bull operates, in that Christian Horner allows Giampiero to just get on with it and deal with Max. At other teams, and we've heard it at Mercedes for argument's sake, when the race engineers of Lewis in particular has voiced a message and Lewis has answered back, or sometimes George has answered back, you get James Vowles, when he was in charge of the strategy team back then before jumping to Williams earlier this season, or even Toto Wolff coming on board and almost admonishing their drivers. Christian doesn't do that. He knows that Giampiero and Max have this relationship, and as I say, he lets them get on with it. Christian came out with a great comment last night post-race when he described Giampiero as Jason Statham-esque, not only in looks, but in terms of his demeanour and character, in that he's tough, no nonsense, and he will not let Max get away with anything. He says it like it is, and that's exactly what he did over the weekend. Unfortunately, this is turned into the main talking point of the race, because one of the other topics that came up was that, is this all a show? Did they put it on just to try and spice things up because Max ran away with it yet again? No, was the absolute categorical answer. This is not a show. This is the way these two guys operate. And I'm just going to clarify something that Matt said. I don't think it was a dull race. It was only dull because Max won. Any other guy coming from sixth on the grid, even at Spa-Francorchamps, where we know overtaking is great, would be raving about this morning. We'd go, oh, what a great performance, some great overtakes. Yeah, okay, it's DRS assisted down the Kemmel Straight, quite obviously one of the best places for DRS. But it wasn't that dull. There was still lots of great overtaking further down the field, as there has been in many other Grand Prix this season. We're only saying it's dull because Max won again.
I mean, it is an interesting dichotomy, isn't it? The way that we're going to look back on this season, similar to the way I always think it's interesting the way Formula One reflects on, for example, Michael Schumacher's era of dominance. Plenty of very straightforward victories there, but somehow over time we've come to reflect on that fondly, as though it was more competitive than it was. But that is because there were many great storylines, in part further behind the winner there. So look, it was one chapter of I think an interesting growing narrative, isn't it? Because I do feel like, as we cross beyond the literal halfway point, but as we cross the mid-season break now, there is a different challenge emerging, and that is, can Red Bull go the distance? Christian Horner's obviously been asked this many times this season, and dead bats this away, really, because your brain tells you it shouldn't be possible. We have too many races, too many things can go wrong, but did feel a little bit like the Belgian Grand Prix with the weather we had with Max Verstappen's penalty. This could have been one of those opportunities, but clearly there's enough performance in hand to guard against some of those. I want to flip this around a little bit, though, and talk about the driver who did lead the race for a small period of time, started from the front row, was Sergio Perez. He is in the same car. He was outclassed by Max Verstappen. There's nothing new there. We've wondered this in the last couple of weeks, Matt, particularly thinking about the Hungarian Grand Prix where Sergio got back on the podium. This was a solid weekend for Perez, but was it a good weekend for Perez?
Interesting question, because if you look at the result, that's where the points are paid out on Sunday afternoon. So on that alone, yes, it was a good weekend. He qualified competitively, so that was okay. But then in the sprint, he went backwards. So that's the only little asterisk I'll put next to it when I say, yeah, it was a good weekend. Certainly in comparison to recent events, his performance was closer to Max. He put the car on the grid where it should be. He delivered a second place finish, which is exactly what Red Bull wants from him. They don't care which order their cars are in fundamentally, as long as they're getting a 1-2, because what that does is gives them an insurance policy, and that's what they haven't had. So Sergio being there has given Red Bull what they want out of that car. It's about as good a weekend as Sergio could have hoped for, really. Max around that place is phenomenal. We saw it last year when he came from, 14th or 16th on the grid. He came from 6th again this year. He was 0.8 quicker in qualifying or whatever it was. He's phenomenal around that place. So take him out of the equation as a phenomenal talent, as I mentioned before. What Sergio delivered was probably all that could have been expected. So in that regard, you've got to say it was a good weekend, just with that sprint asterisk, because he went backwards, and that's a question mark. You've got to look at why that happened. Was it the tyres going off? Was it his own performance? Could he not get their car working in the changeable conditions? That's the only one that I'd go away and have a really good look at if I was Red Bull.
You're forgetting Lewis Hamilton hit him as well.
Oh, of course he did, yes.
Damage the side.
That didn't help.
That's why he primarily went backwards,
Matt. He had a big parachute down one side of the car. Yeah. So that's how busy the race weekends get for us when we're at the track. You forget all these little details as we're going along. But and that's also how fast the sport moves. We've almost forgotten the Lewis Hamilton impact because we're already looking at the race on Sunday, and then pretty soon we'll be looking at Zandvoort and we'll have forgotten all about what happened in Spa.
It's back-to-back podiums.
Don't ask what happened in Australia.
Back-to-back podiums,
it's
isn't
just
it?
so many.
So.
Yeah, it is. It's podiums, and that does count. And I mean, like you say, mate, it is the minimum, right? Like, that is the minimum he's been asked to fulfill. And even if the gap was pretty massive, which I think is kind of interesting. True, it is a longer track, so those numbers are a little bit bigger than they normally are. But I think he'll just take a little bit of momentum now compared to, as Helmut Marko described it, the championship dream he's awoken from to turn his form around a little bit. Let's change tack, though. Of course, take the Australian angle. Oscar Piastri had a pretty standout weekend. It's fair to say he's been probably appropriately highly rated for a lot of this season. He's been rated where he deserves to be rated for his junior career, and the spotlight's been on him because of the way he arrived in the sport. But he has so far up until this weekend, I suppose, been lacking the real breakthrough standout result. It's fair to say he hasn't necessarily had great opportunity to do that, considering where McLaren came from. But in the last month, McLaren's been doing very well and in some pretty torrid conditions. Qualified second, got second into the sprint, second only to Max Verstappen. I want to start with you, Ian, since you can at least bring some balance, some non-Australian bias to the conversation. Is this the day will reflect that Oscar Piastri sort of made a little bit of a mark, acknowledging it wasn't an actual Grand Prix podium and it wasn't a win, but was this an important day for Oscar Piastri's young career?
Definitely. To put it very succinctly to start with, it was a great performance all round across Friday evening and through Saturday. He could not have done any more in that car, and to comprehensively out-qualify and then outrace his teammate in the sprint was testament to the rapid rate at which he is learning, and in particular the growth he is now finding in the car that McLaren has finally put on track. As we all know, major problems over the winter, lagged behind development, nowhere near where they should be in those first few races. They knew that was always going to be the case, and then slowly but surely they put the development on the car, and we've seen Oscar just grow into that car, grow into that team fundamentally now. We're seeing more of his personality come out in press conferences, and we're seeing more of his personality, his character and his talent primarily come through, shine in that car now. Just obviously with regard to the Grand Prix, just a very unfortunate incident. I've listened to Carlos Sainz's comments that he'd made the corner, he was up the inside of Lewis, and we've seen incidents like that in the past. He blamed Oscar quite categorically, that Oscar should have been the one giving way. Yes, he'd got half a car in front, but he'd locked up. If he hadn't locked up into that corner, you could say he was firmly in control of his car. But when somebody locks up, they're not firmly in control of the car. So he'd made his own mistake, and obviously two mistakes don't make a right here, and unfortunately for the pair of them, they both ended up retiring. Oscar within half a lap due to the significant damage to his car. That was just very, very unfortunate, because I'm sure he could have gone on without that incident to have certainly pushed the top three very close, even if the conditions which really prevailed for McLaren and Oscar across Friday and Saturday, given how they were so changeable from wet to dry, and that McLaren across that particular part of the weekend was absolutely set up for those kind of conditions. During a dry Grand Prix, it would have been a little bit more difficult, but I certainly feel, given the confidence he was carrying out Friday and Saturday, he would have been very, very close to the top three. And the Grand Prix on Sunday, just to conclude.
Can I be very biased? I mean, very objective as a journalist, an Australian journalist now. I don't know if it's authentically Oscar's mother, but there was a post that went on social media over the weekend from someone who may or may not have been Oscar's mother, in response to a McLaren tweet where Oscar had a box of donuts or something in front of him. And the comment was, "Have you been into the fake tan again, Oscar?" And it's just those little things that start to show that the barriers are coming down. You know, Oscar through the first half of the year has been very protected, very, very cautious. You know, Formula One's a big stage. It's very easy to say the wrong thing and upset a brand or a sponsor or whatever. So everyone's very cautious as a result. That's why you get a lot of the PR speak where they say a lot and say nothing. And particularly in younger drivers, that's more prevalent because they're more worried about saying the wrong thing. As they get older and more experienced, that disappears, and that's starting to just ebb away from Oscar. And not to say that he's going to say the wrong thing, but he's allowing some of his personality to come through, which is fabulous. But on his performance specifically, he was disappointed with himself over the weekend. He's so hard on himself. He's a little bit like Max in that regard. If something goes wrong, you know, he needs it fixed. He wants it fixed. He's not going to accept something that's 99% right. It's got to be 100% right. And if that means it's him, he'll hold his hand up and say, "I wasn't good enough." And he did that to an extent over the weekend as well. Speaking to Andrea Sella, McLaren's team principal, the growth of Oscar, he says, has been rapid, but it's in line with expectations. The Belgian Grand Prix didn't come as a shock to McLaren in terms of Oscar qualifying at the front and then, you know, getting a podium in the sprint. That's sort of in line with where they'd expect him to be, based on what they've seen since Bahrain forward. Which begs the question, just how good is this guy? If that's where they expect him to be 10 races in, where's he going to be 20 races in? As Ian mentioned, he's sort of knocking on the door of really posing a serious headache for Lando. And Lando is a guy who's rated pretty highly himself. Ian and I had a couple of conversations in the paddock with people who know Oscar, know behind the scenes what's going on and just the quality that he's got. And they're like, yeah, we knew he could do this. This is not a shock. And these are people that are disconnected with McLaren. So even the paddock now is standing up and taking notice. At one point, I'm going to have to name drop here, very sorry. I walked past Max and I said, this was just after the sprint, I said, "You could have let our boy win, couldn't you?" He said, "He'll have enough chances." So even Max Verstappen is not wary, but Oscar's got the respect of Max Verstappen already. So it's fantastic. And then Ian wrote a story for Speed Cafe talking about how Max he loves racing against the new blood that's coming in. This is Max, who's still in his 20s. The new blood that's coming in as well. So it's interesting. One of the things that I've sort of equated this to is, if you look back over the history of the sport, particularly over, I guess, the time that I know best, you look at the Prost and Senna era, you had Michael Schumacher come in at the end of that. When you had the Michael Schumacher era, you had Fernando Alonso come in and Kimi Raikkonen and those sorts of guys, Lewis Hamilton to an extent as well. We're now at the end of that sort of Lewis Hamilton period, and we're seeing Max Verstappen come in potentially, based on what he's shown. Oscar Piastri could be mentioned in that same breath as one of that next generation that's a front runner. I think that's a legitimate conversation to have now. Yes, it's one result from one weekend off the back of 3 positive results from McLaren. Let's not get too carried away. But there's some really, really positive signs there. Everything is doing, it's the right thing. He's giving himself time. He's beating himself up like a race driver should. He's not accepting second best. I don't see anything there that makes me think this guy doesn't deserve to be there. Give him the machinery, and I'm pretty confident in saying that he'll deliver. Of all Australians who've raced in Formula One since Alan Jones, and this is a massive statement, and I know exactly what I'm saying here, I think he's the one who's got the best chance of being a world champion.
Boom. You
I
heard it
think
here
what
first, folks.
it's a big statement. We're going to make sure we make a marker of that one. Not that there's
I
any way to
didn't
really
say he
measure a
will be.
statement
I
like
said he's
that.
got the best chance.
Yeah,
I
best
gave myself
chance.
an out. Gave myself an out.
Yeah, it's very good. I think what for me is really pleasing, and it's something we've remarked on about Oscar Piastri's junior career before, up to this point, or let's say up to this month when McLaren's become much more competitive, is how collected he is, how unawed he is by the Formula One experience. I think Mark Webber, as his manager, can take some credit for that. That seems to be probably the biggest role he's playing in terms of Oscar's transition into Formula One. But I think that that's still impressive now that McLaren is fighting at the front. You know, it's one thing for him not to be overawed by the struggle of battling in the lower half of the grid and sometimes trying to get into Q3 and occasionally trying to score a point and just keeping his nose clean in the chaotic Australian Grand Prix. It's different when you are racing Max Verstappen or Lewis Hamilton. Like, that is completely different. There are so many young drivers you can imagine, talented young drivers, who would see that as an opportunity to make a big statement and do something silly. That he hasn't done that he's really driven, not to say within himself as though he's leaving anything on the table, but the fact that he's done that and just maintained that composure is what is most impressive to me. It's an extension of what we've already seen, but now we're seeing it in more context, and that's holding true, and I think that is really promising. So maybe not, I think your statement's probably correct. We'll wait and see whether or not the ultimate goal comes true, but that'll be a matter for, well, maybe not too many years in the future, let's hope, for everyone's sake. McLaren had a lukewarm race, I guess, compared to standards for the last couple of weeks, but it was an odd weekend. Odd weekend for a lot of teams. In fact, setup is what cruelled them. But Ian, thinking about Lando Norris's race in particular, there was a quiet impressiveness to it, I suppose, because he was starting 7th, dropped pretty much to the back of the field after a pretty poor first two stints. And then I think it's fair to say surprised himself by also finishing 7th. I think there are probably a few drivers who are going, oh, hey, he's back in 7th. How'd this happen? What is McLaren's overall feeling at the end of this weekend, considering it was very up and down and then ended, I guess, kind of in the middle somehow?
Now, I'm going to defer back to Matt, because Matt went and listened to Andrea Stella and his post-race press conference. So Matt is probably the better one to answer. Just generally, I think they will be overall satisfied with what they did at the weekend. Certainly, as I say, you look at the Friday and the Saturday, and Oscar in particular, as we've just discussed, was terrific. The car was set up in the right window, as I mentioned, for those particular kinds of conditions, very changeable. And then Sunday was just dry for the most part, other than that, a very small shower that took place about halfway through. And that's where they fell over themselves a little bit. In particular, as you mentioned, Lando, they just could not get that car to work on those tyres in the first two stints. So much so that people were dropping messages into the McLaren group chat that they set up for the media. What's wrong with Lando? Because people thought there was a fault with the car, there was an issue with the car. As you say, he just plummeted down the field, and they just turned around and said, it's tyres. Can't get the tyres to work. And then finally, third stint, comes out, all of a sudden, car's working again. But as I say, I'll let Matt flesh out a little bit more of the detail, because I'm sure Andrea came up with a good, reasonable explanation as to what went wrong.
Yeah, and Andre is very good in the way he explains things to people like me. So he simplifies them extraordinarily well. Two things basically impacted McLaren's race weekend once it dried out. Firstly, as Ian mentioned, car setup. McLaren is a draggy car. It's good in high-speed stuff. It's got plenty of good handling characteristics through there, but it's draggy, which means it's slow in a straight line, and it doesn't have a low downforce configuration. So if you look at the rear wing on the MCL60 of both Oscar and Lando, they were pretty hefty. They were barn doors by comparison to some of the other cars that were out there. As a result, they were well off the pace in a straight line. There's something in the order of 30 kilometres an hour at points. So down the Kemmel Straight, which is one of the best overtaking opportunities in Formula One, as Ian mentioned a little while ago, they were a sitting duck. There was nothing that they could do. So at the race start and any safety car restarts, they were always going to be vulnerable in that instance. Add into the fact that they couldn't get the tyres working, they don't have the speed to pass, they're slow to the point of being vulnerable, they don't have the pace to really maximise their strengths, which is through the middle sector of the lap where it is a little bit twistier. And until they got onto a set of tyres that they could get working, and the hards were awful in retrospect. Andreas said that if they could run the race again, they'd stay away from the hards entirely. That's how bad they were. But again, this is a product of a sprint weekend. They had one practice session where they got, 1 lap, 2 laps of dry running. It wasn't much. So they had to make some hasty setup decisions with not a lot of data. And this was a byproduct. Now, it's not to say that McLaren could have done much even with the extra time, because they don't have a low downforce configuration on that car. Through all the updates that they've bought, what they've got is what they've got, and it works for circuits like Hungary, which is medium speed, not low speed like many people think, but medium speed. It worked in Silverstone as well. But the strength of that car was through the middle third in Spa, because it had that extra grip. Now, if they trimmed some of that out, it would have given them a little boost down the front straight, but down the Kemmel Straight rather. But they would have gained a little bit there and lost a lot through the middle third. So it was more efficient for them to run the way they did. Once that car was on a set of tyres that it liked, it came alive, as we saw Lando demonstrate. Had they known that information at the start of the race, who knows where they could have been, potentially up towards Lewis in P4. But yeah, it's interesting. There's still learnings there, and there's still work clearly that needs to be done behind the scenes at McLaren. That's very obviously a weakness that we've got 2 races before we get to Monza. Well, one really. We've got Zandvoort and then Monza after the break. McLaren don't have a lot of time to come up with a solution to get there. And Andrea Stella said that it's urgent. They cannot race like that if they're in that sort of configuration when they get to Monza.
Yeah, they need a new rear
Let's
wing.
change tack now to...
Yeah.
Let's change tack now to one of McLaren's would-be rivals, Alpine. We all thought Alpine was probably looking good to head the midfield at the start of the year. Things have not gone quite the way the team had planned, both on track and, as it turns, off track, because on Friday Alpine announced not 1 but 3 senior management figures would be leaving the team. These are team principal Otmar Savnauer, sporting director Alan Permain, very long-serving, long-term Formula One identity Alan Permain, and also Chief Technical Officer Pat Fry, who is going to Williams. So one of the 3 at least will be hanging around the paddock in the next 12 months. This comes, of course, after last week. CEO Lauren Rossi was moved to special projects, which, at least in the radio and media industry, doesn't normally mean you're working, but I assume Renault Group, they do have a job for him sorted out somewhere. We've had Bruno Famine come in over to the vice president roles, essentially head of motorsport. The bottom line is there's a lot of change happening at Alpine in only the last couple of weeks. Ian, do we call this a clean out? Is that what's happening here? Is this a fresh start now for Alpine?
It's been a disaster for the last 2.5 years, never mind the last 2.5 months. Matt and I decided over the course of the weekend, Matt primarily came up with this really good idea to do a timeline article as to what has happened, all the ins and outs since the rebrand took place in January 2021 when they went from Renault to Alpine. And it makes for absolutely fascinating reading, because you've got to think of the number of characters that have come and gone over that period. You think of Marcin Budkowski, Alain Prost, Laurent Rossi coming in, being appointed the CEO, then gets shunted sideways. And now we've got this trio of key figures all of a sudden, not just in the middle of a season, in the middle of a Grand Prix weekend of all things, being announced as they're going. You just cannot make this team up at the moment in terms of how bad they are with regard to their PR and how they go about doing things. I'm going to drop a little bit of insight here, and I don't think it's going to get me in any kind of trouble, but over the past couple of weekends, Alpine has engaged an outside company to conduct interviews with various members of the media, of which I was one. I think Matt was actually invited, but I don't think he had the opportunity to take them up on it during the course of the Hungarian Grand Prix weekend, to engage us in what we thought they could do better as a PR team, because things just aren't working for them everywhere across that team from front to back. And I won't give too much away because obviously it's primarily for the PR team to pick up on, but needless to say, things could be better, for putting it politely, shall we say. And then we get this across this particular weekend, as I say, where they drop this in the middle of a Grand Prix weekend. I know they were reacting to an article that appeared in L'Equipe. L'Equipe had got the news out first, and I'm guessing they did not want to be faced with a barrage of questions across the rest of the weekend, so they just decided, well, we might as well release the news now and get it out of the way and get everybody on board with it. But to lose the characters that they have, and in particular, Michael, you've already mentioned it, Alan Permain, 34 years with that organisation. He is one of the most knowledgeable, well-respected, well-versed people in that paddock. He will not be out of a job for too long. Toto Wolff and Christian Horner, I asked them both the question about Alan, as to what they thought of him. If they haven't done so already, they will be doing so very, very quickly in terms of tapping him up to see what his situation is. I know Otmar Zafnar has got a 12-month gardening leave period now written into his contract. That means he cannot work for another team, but he can actually still be involved in Formula One. He can go and work with Formula One. He can go and work with the FIA. But after what has happened, and I know speaking to him a few times over the weekend, he's choked about this because he felt that he was putting in place a decent plan. And then they've now brought in Bruno Famin, who was like a rabbit caught in headlights in his press conference on Friday afternoon, and he was so sketchy with his answers. We've got a plan. Well, what's the plan? Well, we'll come up with it, basically was his simple answer, without actually putting any flesh on the bones as to what this plan is. Basically, from the outside looking in, they're just making these changes without a clear identity as to where this team wants to go. They say that Bruno said that behind the scenes management, the top brass, didn't feel that their what they wanted from this team and what Alan and Otmar were coming back with were aligned. We all know about this 100 Grand Prix plan to get to the front of the grid. I'm wondering whether behind the scenes now, and this hasn't actually come out now, whether Otmar and Alan were thinking, we're going to need a little bit longer. And I think now Luca Di Maio, the chief CEO, has turned around and said, no, it's 100 Grand Prix. We're going to make these changes. We're going to make this work. We're not listening to you guys. Out you go.
That 100 race plan is out of the window. It's not going to happen. They're not going to reach it. Not a chance. They don't have any Formula One experience at the very top of that team now. Certainly not in the real key positions that matter. And an extension of this is, imagine yourself, Michael and Ian, your engineers with itchy feet at another team. Is Alpine at the top of your list as one to join right now? Attracting new staff right now is going to be difficult. There's going to be a period where this will play out and it'll all settle down and it'll be fine again. But right now, Alpine is not an attractive place to go and work. Conversely, if you're an engineer within Alpine and you've got itchy feet and you've seen that Otmar and Alan have gone, Alan in particular, someone who's been there for 34 years, he was there through Michael Schumacher and Fernando Alonso, all the schmozzle that happened in sort of the 2010s with Lotus and all that sort of stuff. He's been there throughout. You know, he is a tent post of that organisation, and he's now gone. So if they're going to treat long-standing, loyal, highly regarded, highly respected staff members like that, what loyalty are they going to have to the rank and file? So if you're an engineer or someone there that's half a mind to look for another opportunity, you're going to go and pursue that now, aren't you? So they're pushing staff out the door as well, effectively. So retention is going to be a key issue. Attraction is going to be a key issue. Coming up with some sort of plan now. There's fundamental resources that they need, wind tunnels and things that they don't have that rivals do. That's a 3-year project. This isn't something that we'll sign off on a new wind tunnel and you've got it in 6 months. That's a 3-year deal. So there's big things, big ticket items that Otmar and Alan were well aware of that team needs, and that's why they were probably hesitant on the 100 race plan thing. Probably what swung the opinion of Renault's management, because that's what Luca De Meo is, but Alpine management as well, is the advancement that Aston Martin showed this year. That's proof you can go and be fast, much faster than what we are. And then you've got McLaren halfway through the season making that massive jump as well, and that probably accelerated things, because we were told that conversations have been happening with Otmar for some time. Well, yeah, okay. But they accelerated enormously in the days between the Hungarian and the Belgian Grand Prix, because in Hungary, Alan Permain was presented to the media. So was Otmar. If you've got someone who's going to be out of the door in a week's time, you don't put them in front of the media, because at that point they're a loose cannon in many regards. So they can say what they like about how this has been in the works for some time and how it was by mutual agreement and all that sort of stuff. I'm not buying it. Otmar and Alan were sacked. They can dress it up, they can put whatever lipstick they like on that one, but they were sacked. And I think it will play out that it's probably the wrong call. That team will bleed for the rest of the season. And it begs the question, how serious is Alpine and Renault about remaining in Formula One? What is the future of that team? We know they've just cashed out to the tune of 200 million with Ryan Reynolds being involved. His opinion right now would be fascinating. So what does that mean for the rest of the team? Are they now in the market to sell? Are they going to double down their investment and take it seriously? Because they're not taking it seriously right now. There's a lot of question marks there and no answers forthcoming at this point beyond real general, we've got a plan. Okay, tell us.
As Matt mentioned, just to carry on from that, Michael, that on the Sunday after the Hungarian Grand Prix, Otmar was in really relaxed mood. He was in good form, good spirits. He actually seemed to be. I got a sense that there was a little bit of a weight lifted off of him, because Laurent Rossi, although Laurent Rossi was key behind his appointment, Laurent Rossi had also quite heavily criticised Otmar early in the season and the team in general, which I don't think helped his position and why he got eventually moved on. But I got just a sense from Otmar that, as I said, there was a little bit of a weight lifted from his shoulders. There was now no one directly to answer to and report to in terms of the hierarchy, the way it was being structured. And he was talking about the 100 race plan, and he seemed relatively bullish at that point, that from what was going on behind the scenes with the changes that were being made in general in terms of the way they were building towards that goal, he seemed relatively confident that they could actually achieve it. So that was Sunday evening after Hungary, and then 4.5 days later we get the announcement that he's gone. They called it mutual agreement, as Matt said. There was never any mutual agreement there, and I remember asking Bruno Famin the question in the Friday press conference, come on, you've got to be serious. Mutual agreement? No way. So Alan and Otmar stuck their hands up. Yeah, do you know what? We don't agree with you, so we're going to go. Rubbish. Absolute rubbish. They were sacked. Absolutely sacked, because they said, right, you guys, we don't want, if you don't believe in this plan that we're trying to put together, away you go. And obviously, very, very sadly, they have gone, because they are two of the best characters in Formula One. I've always got on with Otmar really, really well, and Matt and I had a little chat with him in the paddock yesterday, and we're hoping he's going to be a forthcoming guest on this podcast in the very near future. I'm going to stay in touch with him, so look out for that one, folks. Once Otmar's had a bit of a break and a bit of a breather, and he's going to be talking all things Formula One. We can't specifically ask him about Alpine and what's gone on there, but we can certainly pick his brains about his thoughts on Formula One in general and where it's going. So fingers crossed, hopefully we can get him on board, just as a nice little plug, as a little teaser there for you coming up.
And look, we're running out of time, guys, so I want this to be a real brief answer. But obviously no experience at the head, no F1 experience at the head of Alpine at the moment. Many key positions to fill, so let's just pick the team principal role. Who's on your list at Alpine? I mean, there are a great many people on the list. Who's realistically on the list for Alpine? And who could possibly turn the reputation of the team around after this pretty shock decision? Start with you, Matt.
The one that's being mentioned is the obvious one, Mattia Binotto. But you've got to ask the question from Mattia Binotto's perspective, why would you want to join that? Outside of him, there's not too many. There is logic behind Mattia Binotto. He has connections to a few people in the team already, but outside of him, there's not many people with good Formula One experience that are just sitting on the sidelines waiting for an opportunity.
Can't look too far beyond Mattia, to be honest. Alpine recently appointed from Ferrari a senior executive figure who has now taken on an equally as senior executive role within Alpine, a gentleman by the name of Philip Kreif. I'm not quite sure how much Philip and Mattia knew of one another, but certainly you would have assumed they would have crossed paths in the past. So it would make sense, and I'm sure if Philip has any connections with Mattia, I'm sure he's already put in a phone call and asked him, and I would not be surprised if that one comes to play some point over the summer break. At the moment, Bruno Famin's taken on this interim team principal role. He didn't come across as a team principal to me, not in terms of the way a team principal should carry himself or herself. But it's a case of watch this space, because as you say, there's many spaces to fill. But at this particular point, if you've got anything about you, do you really want to go to a team like that when it chops and changes so much as it has done over this past 2.5 years since it rebranded to Alpine? I would definitely be thinking twice.
Things do change so fast in Formula One. Alpine definitely feeling that as well. There'll be plenty more to come about this story over the next couple of weeks and really for the rest of the year. But that's all the time we have today on Pit Talk. You can subscribe to Pit Talk wherever you get your favourite podcasts, and you can watch the vodcast on YouTube. Just search for the Fox Sports Australia channel. From Matt Kosh, Ian Parks and me, Michael Laminato, we'll catch you next time.